welcome to this Religion Media Centre briefing. We are going to be looking today at some of the earlier findings of a series of reports that the think tank Theos is publishing over the coming weeks into how religious identity and practice may influence voters as we approach a general election. We have with us some of those involved in the research and some people that we thought might like to comment on it. I'm not going to introduce you all at once. I'll introduce you as I come to you in the conversation. And when we've heard from our main panel, then I will open up to contributions from others on the call. If you have comments and questions, put them in the chat box. I'll either read them out or come to you, or raise a hand and I will look out for you. And I hope somebody will also alert me to whether hands are raised. So just to say, this is a conversation where I hope people feel able to ask questions of each other and interact with one another. And we're going to start now with Paul Bickley, who is the Head of Political Engagement at Theos. And just a really quick opening question, Paul, I would like to know why it's important that Theos does this kind of research.
Thank you, Rosie. Well, I think it's well established that religion has an effect on how people behave in their civic life, in their political life. So we really wanted to understand that ahead of the general election. It's worth people knowing that people of different religious affiliations might vote differently, might think differently, might even choose to vote or not vote, and they will be influenced by their religious views. It's underreported, under-analysed, apart from, of course, recent debates around how the Muslim community will vote in the local elections and general elections in the future. So we wanted to get ahead of the game, make sure this information is out there.
Dr. Siobhan McAndrew, you're a senior lecturer in politics, philosophy and economics at the University of Sheffield. Are you sort of waiting with bated breath for research like this? I mean, what's the value of this, I suppose, for academic researchers like yourself seeking to understand the electorate?
Well, I think it's always fascinating. I think religion continues to be a really important social platform and a platform where people can learn civic skills and feel more motivated, to get involved to try and change the world, to make things better, particularly for people from immigrant backgrounds. It's often places of worship are sites where people can, find friendship and help and social resources. And obviously there are long-standing connections between the Labour Party and, there's a heritage of the Labour Party being more nonconformist and linked to Methodism in earlier decades. And the Church of England and the Conservative Party, I think that is now changing as society is changing. It's becoming more secularised, but there's a lot of social change with growing immigrant diversity and religious diversity as well. But it does seem that more religious people have supercharged networks and a very strong sense of motivation, often to go into electoral politics themselves, which makes this a really interesting area to understand cultural life and political life and demographic change all in one very interesting case study.
Thank you. Now, we'll just do a little bit of looking at the methodology fairly briefly, but Yinxuan Huang from Bible Society, you're the quantitative research manager there, and you're a statistician and number cruncher and quantitative analysis. But tell us about your sample size and just the very broad parameters of your research.
Yeah, so our stories are based on survey data from the British Election Study, or BES, which is the longest running nonpartisan research into British general elections and also the longest running social survey in the UK. So BES covers various aspects of political life and British society and conducts rigorous data and frequent collection. It has been one of the most academically popular sources for analysing UK elections. It was first introduced in 1964, so it's been 60 years. And the specific data we use come from the BES panel study, which was conducted by YouGov approximately twice a year since 2014. And YouGov collects these data over time in successive waves of data collection from an online sample of its panel members. So we utilize a total number of 11 waves selected between 2014 and 2023. So strategically, representing each year over the decade.
And the sample size, I understand, was 30,000. Was that correct for this?
Yeah, so each wave will consist about 30,000 people.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. George Lapshynov, I hope I've got your surname right. You're a political researcher, Theos, and in a moment I'm going to ask you to present some of the findings about the turnout. But the groups that you are analysing are Christians, Muslims, non-religious, and I just would like you to let everyone know why you have to limit yourself to those groups and why you don't, for instance, have findings to share about the likely turnout of Hindu, Sikh, Jewish and other communities.
Yes, so it's an unfortunate aspect of the BS, or indeed almost every polling that is done in the UK, even when it is generally representative of the population. Usually it severely underrepresents religious groups, and particularly minority religious groups. So even the BS, which has a very large sample for a study, 30,000 people, very severely underrepresents the Muslim community, but even more so the smaller minority religious groups. This means that we have to group together religious groups that we would otherwise want to study individually and are simply unable to do so. The data doesn't allow it, which is a shame, really.
Okay, well, look, let's look at a couple of slides on turnout, and just if we could share the first one, religious groups and how likely they are to vote.
So in this first part of the research, we explored the relationship between religious identity and the likelihood of voting. The two key findings here are that Christians are more likely to vote, and Muslims and the other religious voters are the least likely to vote. Christians are significantly more certain that they intend to vote at the next general election. They're more certain than either other religious persons, but they're also more certain than the non-religious, the nones, by a significant margin, almost 10%. The nones are not necessarily uncertain about whether they want to vote or not. They are quite certain that they do not want to vote. Almost a fifth of the nones said they were not intending on voting at the next general election. Muslims, on the other hand, are quite unlikely to vote. Only 66% said that they were very or fairly likely to vote. However, it's not that they're not intending on voting. They're actually much more ambivalent than any other voter. They're more uncertain about this. To anticipate the question of statistical significance, we've done some more complex modeling, which controls for age, gender, level of education, different religiosity variables. And they confirm this. So all the trends we can see in this graph of the raw data are also valid in the multivariate analysis.
So I might think, well, we've got non-religious people who are less likely to vote perhaps than others. Is age the reason for that? Are some of the other differences that, for instance, you're going to share about Christians and Muslims to do with the fact that you've got a younger demographic, perhaps among people who identify as Muslims? How have you anticipated that?
Yes, well, when we saw this raw data at the beginning, obviously we thought, well, Anglicans, who are in the data the most likely to vote, they are also older, they are probably more engaged in local communities. There are other factors that contribute to them being more likely to turn out than Muslims, who are on average much younger than other demographic groups in the UK. They're also more likely to be first-generation immigrants, to be working class. So all of this influences. But when we did control for age in a sort of predictive model, then religious affiliation still mattered. It was still a significant variable in influencing a likelihood of turnout.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to the next slide, which is about how attendance at worship among those groups also affects the turnout.
Well, the very first finding really is that worship attendance, or frequency of worship attendance, actually matters. It has an effect on the data, which is something Theos has found for a lot of its other research as well on attitudes towards dying and other things, is that not just affiliation, but how frequently people actually worship affects things. So for the Christians in particular, there is a sort of positive relationship between attending more frequently and being more likely to vote. This graph, which can be a little bit misleading, shows on the horizontal axis sort of an increased frequency of practice. And so we can see that Anglicans, Roman Catholics, who are likely to vote, worship on average more frequently than those who are uncertain or unlikely about voting. The gap is especially large for the Roman Catholics. And the relationship is inverted for the Muslim and other religious population. There is a little oddity here for the other Christian group, where the two dots are very close and inverted as well. And when we looked into this, it actually appeared that the Eastern Orthodox population was responsible for this. They had, for them, the graph really looked much more like for Islam. They are on average much more frequently practicing than any other Christian group, but they also had this inverted relationship where the more likely to vote were actually practicing less frequently on average.
Let me go to Zara Mohammed for a moment, Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Britain. I mean, Zara, I don't know if you want to comment on the findings there as regards Muslim voters. The more they go to mosque, the more likely they are to vote, but they are less likely, it appears, to vote than Christian voters. And I just wonder what you make of that, and perhaps whether you could reflect on some of the reasons why that might be.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation, and also to Theos for some really, really interesting findings. The Muslim Council of Britain have been supporting, you could say, Muslims in involvement in the democratic process and in electoral kind of uptake for the last 20 years. And what we significantly found, particularly when we started around 2001, kind of those general elections that we've covered, was a general voter apathy and a kind of disconnect between communities and politics and politicians. It's very much, I guess you could say, in terms of general Britons, well, what's the point? Does it change anything? But also a little bit of disconnect between the system and processes and those communities are affected. But as we've found through our campaigns, voter registration drives in the last 20 years, there's been 50% of Muslims are under the age of 24 in England and Wales. So there's a greater consciousness of younger communities around the political system and registering to vote and all the rest of it, but also a more of a consciousness around the policies and procedures. So I would say that it makes sense in that we're still a very young community in amidst the other faith communities. But I think there's still challenges when it comes to voter apathy and disconnect, in which many Muslim communities feel, what's the point? And feel very disconnected to the political system. And particularly as we're seeing right now, there's lots of charged emotions. But I think definitely, as you said, religious communities do feel a sense of duty and obligation. And in the Islamic faith as well, it's you're a citizen of the state, so you need to be contributing to that state. But I think there's also this idea of, well, how am I part of that? But you can also see that through the MPs and the uptake of, Muslim representation in politics as well.
What do you make of the finding that the more likely, the more Muslims worship, go to public worship, the less likely they are, or the less inclined they are to vote? I mean, that's just quite an interesting finding, isn't it? Because it goes against the finding for other groups or Christian groups, that the more religious you are, the more likely you are to vote.
Yeah, that was particularly interesting, and something that probably we would want to unpack a little bit further as part of our general election campaign this year. We're certainly going to be doing a lot of listening exercises. Generally, I would have also assumed that if you're part of a congregation, you would be more inclined to vote. But that could also come down to, again, the lack of awareness or understanding of the political literacy, you could call it, in mosques and in congregations. But it's probably something that I think we could take back and find out a little bit more about. I would say the changing age demographic of Muslim communities will maybe show in future a change to that. Given that you've got a younger, more integrated and British Muslim kind of identity. But yeah, I thought that was particularly interesting.
Keith Kahn-Harris, you're an Associate Fellow of Institute for Jewish Policy Research and a lecturer at Leo Baeck College, and I know that your colleague Carly Lessoff from JPR is also on the call. I just wonder, we haven't got breakdowns for Jewish communities and their take on voting or not. I just wonder whether you've done research in this area or what your impressions are.
Yes, thanks very much for having us here. I'm fascinated by this poll, this analysis, in part because whilst we do have some data on who Jews vote for. I'm not aware of surveys that ask about, do you intend to vote? I could be wrong. Harley is allowed to jump in if she knows of this evidence. And I think actually that's a finding in and of itself, because it kind of is a sense within the Jewish community that we're well established, and that things like turnout, getting people to vote, is not the primary challenge we have in terms of involvement in Jews in the public sphere.
Carly, has JPR done any research on Jewish turnout or not?
Well, over the last 4 or 5 years, we have been running an online panel, and we have just recently been trying to analyse that data because we're coming towards the election, but though we don't have full results yet. And in that, we did ask how people voted last time and asked about, so it's possible we could do the analysis, but I'm not aware of anything we've done in the past.
Is the particular sort of turnout?
Yes, indeed. Well, we have asked people if they voted. I mean, an option was to say, I did not vote. So we could look back at the data, but I'm not aware of any analysis either. Perhaps somebody else has done it, but I'm not aware of it.
Thank you. So let's go to the slides about how people vote. And Paul, you're going to talk us through this.
Okay, so this is a snapshot of how people were intending to vote according to the BS wave that was taken about a year ago. So this data is about 1 year old. You can see that in the population as a whole, the Labour Party are already substantially leading and by a significant margin. But when we begin to break that down by religious groups, we see some interesting variations. So Christians as a whole are more likely to vote Conservative, and that is particularly true of the Anglican group here. So that long-standing association, saying that the Church of England is the Conservative Party at prayer, it seems surprisingly durable. Although the equally long-standing association between the Roman Catholic community, so people would talk in the past about a Roman Catholic Labour vote, we think that has now more or less gone. And in the longitudinal data that we have from the waves of BS data from 2014 onwards, we see that the Roman Catholic community basically tracks the national average. So although it appears from this chart as if they are substantially Labour supporting, that is because they're following the national average by now. What else? Of course, there's been a lot of talk about the Muslim vote recently. And as we know, in previous general elections and in previous elections, the Muslim community has substantially voted for the Labour Party, and probably by even a larger margin than we see here. So 58% of the Muslim community saying that they would intend to vote Labour in a general election. Is at the time this data was taken, would probably, if there was a general election, it would have probably been a larger effect than that.
This was pre-October, presumably.
Yes, so this is from May last year.
Right.
So
okay.
we could assume I personally would assume that this would shift, but we don't know where votes would shift to. We simply don't have the data to know to what extent and to where Muslims would vote differently in May 2024 as opposed to May 2023. So yes, and you can see here also just thinking finally about that no religion group. That is again that's substantially Labour supporting, and that's a consistent trend across time.
Okay, let's just have a look at the next slide, which is on worship attendance and what difference that makes.
Yeah, so we approached the data with probably the same hypothesis that if you factored in an analysis by frequency of practice, or also there's some measures in the BS which are to do with self-reported religiosity. We don't have a slide for that here, but this is again intention to vote when analysed through the lens of frequency of attendance at worship. We see that some interesting things change. So whereas in the Christian group as a whole, they are more likely to vote Conservative. We can see that Labour voting Christians are more frequently attending. And that is also true of the Anglican community. So that relationship between the Anglican community and Christians as a whole and the Conservative Party, when you factor in religious attendance, that flips. Perhaps for the Roman Catholic community there, maybe the sign of that association between Roman Catholic and Labour, that affinity still survives. But again, this is indicative that for those that are frequently practicing, or at least for Labour voting Roman Catholics, are more frequently practicing than Conservative voting Roman Catholics on average. If we go to, if people attend the Islam Muslim figures there, this could be slightly misleading. What you're seeing here is that blue dot on the far right-hand side represents Conservative voting Muslims. That is a small group of people. So that blue dot represents not very many people, but we see that of those not very many people, they are far more frequently practicing than really anybody else on this chart. So there's potentially something interesting there, but at this point, the core numbers are small enough to make it difficult to make bold claims. Conservative voting Muslims are very frequently practicing. It's also just worth saying here that one thing you see is that, of course, in this data, we see that the Muslim community is as a whole far more frequently practicing than other religious groups, particularly Church of England and so. But that's well known. So there's lots of interest here, I think.
Thank you, Siobhan, McAndrew. I just wonder whether there are any sort of things that really strike you from those findings. I mean, I'm particularly interested in the change in the Roman Catholic vote, and given what you were saying earlier about migration and voting patterns, I just wonder if you have any reflections on that.
I think the reports they're really interesting and beautifully presented, and I think the British election study is just a very rich and fascinating source. I'm slightly wary of calling some of these effects like the religious vote. It's because, say I go to church sometimes, but I wouldn't say that my vote is a Catholic vote. I also play music and I also do sports, but I wouldn't say that my vote is a runner's vote or a classical musician's vote. So I think some of the effects may be causal, but I think a lot of them are also associational. And I think a second thing is that the composition of some of these groups has changed, inexorably, but quite substantially over the past 40 years. So the Catholic community, I think with generational change, the working class Catholics have secularized and are more often found now in the no religion group. So the children of immigrants, or the grandchildren of immigrants from Poland and Ireland and so on. So it isn't so much that somehow Catholicism has changed, but it's changed in its community rather than in its alignment with politics. I think with the graphs of turnout and political choice by attendance, it would be more helpful to see the level of attendance and then the level of turnout and party choice for each, because it would help us make more sense of the data. As it is, it's quite hard to see, whether attendance is boosting turnout for Muslims in particular. So I checked the numbers. It does seem that Muslims who attend mosque more often are slightly less likely to vote, but a lot of that could be an age effect or a citizenship effect, an immigrant generation effect, and also the differences look quite small. So I think we should be very careful before commenting, before interpreting that there's some sort of negative effect on participation for Muslim citizens and Muslim residents in Britain.
Thank you. I'd like Paul just to respond to the first point, Paul Bickley, if you would, about what Siobhan was saying was, I might go to church, but I'm also, interested in music and sport. I mean, the very thing about doing the research into religion. I mean, I know I raised it at the beginning about why you were doing this, but what's your response to that? And sort of, is it that you could attach too much importance to religion and denominationalism because it is associational rather than absolutely key to people's motivations in voting?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. So I think what we would say is that it would be very reductive to treat it's easy to be reductive, isn't it? So in any group, there will be a series of factors, and it will include age or average age, the composition from an ethnic point of view. It will include socioeconomic position, and those all have an effect. It would also be reductive to say that religion has no effect. What is difficult to know is the relative strengths of each. On the turnout, as we said, we did some analysis which sought to control for some of those demographic factors, and we see that what we're confidently saying is that religion is having an effect. The kind of the size, the amplitude of that effect is difficult to tell, but it's quite right. And of course, at an individual level, different kind of factors of our identity are. You've got to go down to the individual level to understand what is driving an individual to vote. I am, let's say, a cyclist. That might seem like an irrelevant thing, but of course, I could be very interested in cycling policy and who is most supportive of cycling or who's been negative about cyclists. So that's, of course, that could be a thing. But religion is a deep identity, or tends to be a deep identity. Of course, part of what we're seeing here and why we analysed by religious practice is to distinguish between, at least at a kind of high level, between people who are just saying, I have an identity here, and then those who are, as it were, practicing that identity. So I think that in a way that absolutely validates the point that for those that hold it very deeply to the point where it basically shapes how they use their time, religion has a different effect to those who just have it as a kind of mere affiliation, as it were.
Thank you. I wonder if I could just come to James Somerville-Michael from the Catholic Union. I don't know how you respond to the finding that the RC voters, Roman Catholics have become sort of the average rather than the sort of distinctive voters. What's your response to that?
Well, it's very interesting, and certainly I think confirms what we've seen anecdotally, which is this sort of breakdown between the Catholic community, trade unions, and the Labour Party vote, and that becoming much more fluid. The thing that was really interesting was the fact that Catholics who go to mass more are voting Labour, because of course in America actually that's the other way around. The more often you go to mass in America, the more likely you are to be on the centre right. I mean, it would be interesting to tease out from the panelists who've spoken whether they think that sort of push or pull factors at play. We heard a bit of it about, I think from Siobhan, about sort of demographic changes and kind of first generation people settling down and perhaps becoming more secular. I mean, is it associated with the policies that Labour are pursuing? I mean, is it something that the parties can change? In other words, do they have agency in this, or is it kind of forces beyond their control?
When it comes to the Catholic community, what Siobhan said was quite right. So there's been compositional change in the Catholic community, and that would clearly be very important. Would have to be factored into how we understood and sort of received these results. But there have also been policy conflicts, specifically between the Labour government governments running up to 2010, and we see that is when things shift. In that period of time, things begin to shift. So it seems to me that amongst the basket of things that are happening, some of them are demographics, definitely, or compositional, but some of them may be to do with that kind of diminished sense of this party gets us. Or we have a particular voice or a particular platform, or that we're well heard here. So I think that policy conflicts can play a part. Very clearly they do, and they're clearly playing a part in our electoral processes this year. But it's not one or the other; it's both and.
Can I just come back to Keith Kahn-Harris and Carly Lessoff? I mean, Keith, you were about, I think, to tantalise us with some information about how Jewish voters vote, and Dilwar Hussain raises quite a point in the chat box about how denomination has a bearing on voter attendance. It's not just being Jewish or Hindu or Christian or whatever. It's the denomination that you attend, and I just wonder what you know about Jewish communities and their voting in that regard.
The clear story over the last 30 years or so has been the drop in support for Labour within the Jewish community. Now, historically, Labour was the party of Jews. In the mid-90s, it was around 40% of the community who voted Labour. In the last election, while we don't have exact figures on that, it was probably no more than 10%. And obviously the controversies during the Corbyn's Labour Party did accelerate a trend that was already happening. But if you look in more detail at the figures, what you find is that it's actually what's happening is Jews are voting along the lines of other people in that socio-economic category. And that what's really happened in the last few decades is a kind of belated, if you like, correction. That Jewish, if you like, living up but voting down, to put it in very crude ways, did last a long time, but it's now sort of in a sort of corrective sort of pattern. What I would say, though, is that the voting figures don't necessarily correlate between with Jewish involvement within political parties. If you look in that respect, the Jewish involvement in Labour is still incredibly important. It's still incredibly visible, to the point that during the Corbyn years, what you had was essentially a kind of Jewish civil war within the Labour Party between Jews of different kinds who both had decades of involvement in Labour politics, but on different wings of the party. In terms of how this breaks down denominationally, that is a bit above my pay grade. As I said, this is not the main research that I generally do. It's certainly, as was the last question, as we talked about turnout, it would be possible to do that kind of research, but I'm not entirely sure as to whether it's been done, whether Orthodox Jews are more likely to vote Labour or Conservative. Maybe Carly has some information there. I'm not sure.
We have done some analysis, and there is a denominational gradient where more conservative religion, more religious, or slightly, if we can use a left-right metaphor, but the more traditionally religious tend to be somewhat more conservative. That again, I completely agree with what Keith said. Historically, it was a strong Labour vote, but it has shifted. I don't think it dropped quite as far as Keith implied. I think his numbers slightly more draconian than the evidence that we are just literally trying to analyse and pull out at the moment. There has been a recovery of the Labour vote. Again, I don't want to say too much, but it isn't necessarily to do with it's essentially demographic, a return to natural constituencies in terms of demographics of voting. What else can I tell you? But yes, there is a religious gradient, without a shadow of a doubt.
Thank you. Now, we did have somebody from the Network of Sikh Organisations on the call, but he's had to go and look after a sick child. So I'm going to just call on my colleague, Amadit Bassi, and ask, I'm not expecting you to give us numbers and crunch statistics and all that, Amadit, but I mean, what's your impression about turnout and voting patterns among Sikhs in this country?
Well, from the kind of anecdotal evidence and stories I've written over the years, Sikhs do generally vote. They are encouraged to vote. And generally, again, the vote has been for Labour. However, increasingly, there is an indication that Sikhs will be voting, probably spreading their vote Certainly there's been problems with the Sikh community and this particular government, issues to do with the politicization of the separatist movement in India for a Sikh homeland. And that's really had a real kind of bad effect with the relationship with the Tory party. Also, to note is that there's an increasing, particularly amongst young Sikhs, a turn to almost fundamental Sikhism, which shuns voting and shuns democracy. Some may say this is extremist, it follows other kind of extremist ideologies, but there is this increasing sense of returning to some kind of Sikh, Sikh councils, etc., etc. Recently, there was the opening of the world's first Sikh court in London. So there is this kind of gradual separation really going on. But yeah, there is no, the traditional, as we said, Sikhs voting Labour. That's a thing of the past now, really, and they're much more discerning. There is a body called the Sikh Federation, which actually bills itself as a Sikh political party. It's more of an advisory body, and that has pretty much made it clear to all of its members not to vote Labour this year.
I think the issue of Gaza, Israel, has been an issue in Sikh communities as well, hasn't it? But I mean, Zara, Mohammed, I suppose the big question everybody's going to be asking is how the conflict in Israel-Gaza is going to affect Muslim voting in the general election. I mean, I don't know if the MCB has a position on that, but I mean, any predictions about what's likely to happen to the Muslim vote? And I suppose, I know it made a difference in terms of local councils. Constituencies are much bigger, parliamentary constituencies. Is it actually likely to have effect on the kind of parliament we might get after the election?
I think it's certainly going to be a different kind of vote. Obviously, Muslim communities are not homogenous. They're very diverse. But on this particular issue, they're very much united. And I think that's why we've seen other groups, and particularly the reaction we saw in the local elections with independent candidates. I think what's difficult for Muslim communities is that the big parties have got quite a strained relationship with Muslim communities. We saw that with the Conservatives and Lee Anderson and Suella and all the rest of it. So there is a real feeling of disenfranchisement right now. I think there will still be quite a change in voting, particularly away from Labour votes. That's just apt to see from the conversations we're hearing. We're non-partisan, so our job is to get people registered to vote and get them involved, and encouraging political parties to engage in Muslim communities and have conversations. Of course, the politics of Britain are important to all of us, and it's really important that all the diversity of Britain is involved in that conversation. But I think there's a lot of trust that needs to be repaired, and a lot of resetting in terms of what many Muslim communities are saying is that their votes have been taken for granted. And I think that's really clear to see. So I think there will be a difference. But as you said, general elections are just different on scale and in the boundary changes. But I think where there is significant demographics of Muslim communities, there could be protest votes, there could be independents, and there could be a marked shift in who does actually get elected.
Thank you. Something about, does the research, I'm not sure if it does, but Paul, do you detect any mismatch between religious leaders and the adherents? I mean, certainly the impression a lot of people would have is that, the Anglican bishops are a lot of leftists, but the Anglicans in the pews are not. I mean, what's really interesting is what your research shows about how the more likely you are to worship, actually, the more likely you are to go towards the left. But I just wondered, is there anything you can say about that sort of perceived mismatch in Christianity or maybe in other faiths as well?
That point has been made quite widely. We can't see it in the data other than in the way you've already said, so that we see this difference between practiced religion and just religion as an identity. Of course, we are slightly dealing with averages there, so that the Labour voting Anglicans, for example, what's their average attendance? And we do see that they attend more frequently. I think it's an interesting point though to think about. Well, how if you're a politician or if you're a party and you're thinking about what this data means to you, it will definitely change how you reach out different communities. And I would say I would advise people to go and have the difficult conversations where they're a bit weaker. So the Conservative Party should be asking itself why more frequently practicing Christians are less likely to support them, this data won't tell them that, but they can go and have the conversation. And if future waves of the BAS show a change in, for instance, the Muslim vote, then for Labour, then clearly that kind of sets that's a task setting finding, isn't it? I suspect this sort of in a loose way validates the observation that lots of people have made that Anglicans as a whole in the pews are a bit different to Anglicans who are leading the churches, the kind of clerical versus lay vote. Also bear in mind that many of the Anglicans in this sample have described themselves as Anglican but never do anything about it. I.e., there's probably three groups. There's the clergy, there's the people in the pews, and then there's the people who say that they're Anglicans and that means something to them, but they're never in church. That's we need to factor that in as well.
Related to this, Paul Smalley, I don't know whether you would reflect on the question that you put into the chat box.
I've been influenced by James Crossley's work on how politicians use the Bible to say, have different versions of what the Bible actually says. And I'm wondering if the panel thinks this data shows that a conservative appeal to a Cameron-esque Bible, that traditional British values are what the Bible's really about, or Thatcher's Bible, it's all about hard work and family values, is likely to be more fruitful than a left-wing appeal to Tony Benn's radical socialist Jesus Bible.
The correlation that we are observing between a frequency of practice and a sort of a propensity to vote for Labour would suggest that there is some appeal to the sort of more radical socialist Jesus, if you want. Paul, my colleague said earlier on about the questions that the Conservative Party can ask themselves in light of this data. Why are Christians who vote Conservative the ones who go to church less often? I wonder whether appealing to a Thatcherite interpretation of the gospel is sort of really what is going to give them to attract more frequently practicing Christians to the Conservative Party.
I just wanted to add to discussion something which I don't think we've discussed extensively before is geography. A major factor in the significance or otherwise of religious or indeed ethnic votes is dependent on how dispersed they are throughout the country, given our electoral system. I should add in the Jewish world, for example, there are only about 300,000 of us, and we're heavily concentrated into a few small areas. In fact, we're not even a majority in any one electoral constituency. The same is the case with Muslims, who are often very heavily concentrated in a few areas. Now, going back to the question about Keir Starmer, the numbers, viewed in purely instrumental terms, there's probably a calculation that needs to be made as to whether, however much, for example, Muslim opinion has turned against the Labour Party, whether that actually matters to them electorally, whether they can make it up from votes in areas where there are relatively few Muslims in that constituency, which is, of course, not how I think politics should be done, but I think it is often how politics is done. And until we have an electoral system that works on aggregate percentages, the locality issue is going to be the most important thing.
Thank you. Now, we haven't got very long left. Andrew Brown has a question. So, Andrew, would you like to put that?
I was interested in whether you think the religious vote will affect upcoming discussions on assisted suicide or euthanasia, and if so, in which directions?
I don't think that will be a driving concern in the debate. It seems to me that obviously the cases often made by proponents of a change in the law that want to see assisted suicide, that those people who oppose do so for religious reasons, but then there are lots of people, and I think the polling shows this, that there are lots of religious people that support a change in the law. It seems to me that it's not. It's other concerns are more central now to the debate. I think this is part of a society that is, in some senses, more secular, and the trade-offs will be between the concerns of disability rights campaigners, for example. I don't think that arguments made on religious premises will shift the debate in Parliament a lot. But of course, there will be lots of religious people out there for whom that will be an important part of their vote and their thinking about their vote. And probably in the things that we don't see, the one-to-one conversations, the hustings events, the writing to the MP, their kind of general citizenship, that will be part of what they do. So it won't. I don't think it will be a driver of the debate, although it will be there. But it will drive how people act, if that's reasonable.
Thank you. I'm actually going to move on because there's a really interesting question from James Sullivan Michael. Sorry, I hope I'm pronouncing your name half right. In the box about whether anything from the data, or whether we need data, and research into the individual faith of party leaders. We've got a Hindu prime minister, we've got an atheist leader of the opposition, and lo and behold, reply pops up from Ekaterina Kolpinskaya saying we're doing some research on this. So Ekaterina, please tell us about the research that you're doing, and where are you from?
Hello. So we're currently doing research on this, and there is already, Paul will know, we already published one blog with them, right? So was it last summer, Paul, I think? So we're kind of looking into this at the moment. It's all experimental research because the moment...
That's where you're from, Ekaterina. Where are you from?
Oh, pardon me. Sorry, yes. It's University of Exeter, but this is a collaborative research with University of Exeter, Queen Mary University, London as well. So we're looking basically at how people respond to politicians being religious and what kind of religious information they are looking for, or reward or penalize, as it were, when it comes to politicians. So it is very much work in progress, which is why we only have a couple of blogs and stuff to contribute at the moment. But the summer is time for a big conjoint experiment, which should allow us to separate the effects. Because at the moment, it's really difficult, as some contributors pointed out, to separate the effects of a religious ID of a politician to what the expected behaviors are with regards to, say, social issues such as reproductive rights and so on. So we're trying to separate these two.
I have to ask, are you looking at Scotland as well? Because, the obvious example that we've all been thinking about recently is Kate Forbes and the effect that her faith had on her leadership bid and so on. So this is UK-wide, or...
Britain, really, so not Northern Ireland. So the Kate Forbes was partially an inspiration for this research, actually. So we are looking, we're working with YouGov on this. So it's basically a nationally representative sample, but the caveat here is we do not attach party labels. So it is if the parties are disengaged, right? So experimental conditions, vignettes that are based on individual characteristics, if you do not have a rosette, as it were.
And when can we expect this research to be published?
This is a very good question. Usually experimental research takes 2 to 6 years to publish. But preliminary findings we should be able to share once we finish the field work. So that hopefully will be within the next 6 months to a year, perhaps.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Now we're out of time. I'm just going to go to Andrew Grayston from Theos. Andrew, there's more research coming out from Theos soon. I'd like you to very briefly tell us what it is, and then I'm going to go to George and ask him finally to put himself one shoe in Keir Starmer's shoes, one foot in Keir Starmer's shoes and the other in Rishi Sunak's, and ask him which he would rather be in, given what these findings tell us. So, Andrew, tell us what's coming up.
Thank you, Rosie. This the research that we published today, which is on the Theos website, is the first output of a series that we'll be producing over the coming few months. There are papers coming up about values. So essentially, why do religious people vote the way they do? And some about specific policy areas such as migration or the economy. And so do keep an eye on the Theos website, theosthinktank.co.uk, for both today's publications and anything that's coming in future. And if there are further questions after today's meeting, please feel free to get in touch.
Our Prime Minister can rely on the Anglicans, if you want, in a sense, in the light of this data. There is, there are the number of practicing Anglicans might be small, but there is still a very large number of cultural or nominal Anglicans who are supporting the Conservative Party. I don't think in any of the data we've seen there is a growing number of religious people in the UK recently who so even if more frequently practicing Christians vote Labour, for example, since that number is actually going down, that's not very good for Labour. However, I would say that the Labour Party, in the last year or so especially, has been making extraordinary efforts to engage more with religious communities. And in that sense, there's probably something more positive and constructive happening between Labour and religious communities in the UK. So from the perspective of sort of being able to rely on a certain group, probably Conservative, but sort of more positive prospects, certainly Labour, as far as sort of the religious vote goes.
Very diplomatic. Thank you so much, everybody. It's been a really interesting discussion. I'm sure we're going to want to do lots more talking like this in the next few months. Thank you so much for joining us, and hope to see you again soon.